I was 14 years old and I was left literally at boarding school in Switzerland. Nobody came to
There are some people in this world who don't just live their lives. They burn through them like shooting stars.
pick me up. I really did not know what I was going to do. And a friend of mine, a classmate,
Leaving trails of light that never quite fade away. Shirley MacLaine is one of those rare souls.
had me join her and her family while I tried desperately to get a hold of my parents.
For over 7 decades, she has dazzled us on screen, challenged every rule Hollywood
You were sort of an unconventional mom.
Yeah.
And an unconventional wife, too, I guess, yeah?
Yes.
ever made, and lived by a code that most people wouldn't dare to follow. But now, at 91 years old, as she sits alone in the New Mexico desert watching the sun set over mountains that have seen a million stories, there's something different in her eyes. Something that looks like peace mixed with sadness. Something that makes you want to reach through time and hug that little girl who once danced until her feet bled, just to feel like somebody loved her. If Shirley MacLaine has ever made you laugh, made you cry, or made you believe that a woman could rewrite her own destiny no matter what the world said, then please hit that like button right now, because what I'm about to share with you isn't just a story about a famous actress. It's a story about survival, about choosing yourself when everyone else wants to own you, and about the heartbreaking price of living life on your own terms. Let me take you back to where it all started. Back to a time when America was broken, when families were hungry, and when a little red-haired girl was born into a world that didn't have much room for dreamers. Shirley MacLaine was born on April 24th, 1934 in Richmond, Virginia. But she wasn't born into glamour or comfort. She was born right in the middle of the Great Depression, when people were losing their homes, when bread lines stretched around city blocks, and when even having a warm coat was considered lucky. Her father, Ira Beatty, was a high school psychology teacher who had to sell real estate at night just to keep the electricity on. Her mother, Kathleen, had come all the way from Canada to teach drama, filling their small brick house with Shakespeare quotes and dreams that felt bigger than their bank account. The Beatty family moved constantly, from Richmond to Norfolk, then to Arlington, always searching for something better, always one step away from real stability. In that restless home, little Shirley learned early that love was something you earned through achievement, not something that just existed freely. Her parents cared about her, but they expected perfection. And when her baby brother Warren was born 3 years later, everything shifted. Suddenly Warren became the golden child. He was charming, athletic, naturally likable. Meanwhile, Shirley was the serious one, the girl who read too many books and asked too many questions. She would watch from the doorway as her parents' faces lit up when Warren entered the room, and she felt something painful growing in her chest, a desperate need to be noticed, that hunger to prove she was worth loving too. I always felt like an understudy in my own family, she said years later, and that feeling, that ache of not being quite enough, would drive her for the rest of her life. But then there was something else wrong, something that made everything even harder. When Shirley was just 3 years old, doctors told her parents that her ankles were too weak, that she might never be able to stand properly. Can you imagine being that young and already being told your body is failing you? It's heartbreaking. Her parents were devastated, but the doctor suggested something that would change everything. They said ballet might help strengthen her legs, so this tiny girl, barely old enough to understand what pain meant, was sent to the Washington School of Ballet. And let me tell you, she didn't dance because she loved it at first. She danced because she had to. Because her body hurt. Because every step was a battle against her own weakness. I didn't dance because I loved it, Shirley confessed many years later. I danced because I had to. Every single day after school, while other children played outside, Shirley would practice. Her toes would blister and bleed. Her muscles would scream. But she kept going because each pirouette was proof that she was stronger than everyone thought. Each time she stayed standing was a victory against the doctors who said she might never walk right. The Great Depression taught her family to stretch every single penny they had. Ballet taught her to stretch every dream until it became real. Their house was full of books and intelligence, but it wasn't always full of warmth. Her father's practical nature clashed with her mother's artistic soul, and Shirley would sit quietly at the dinner table as tension simmered between them. But in that uncomfortable silence, she learned something incredibly important. She learned how people hide their deepest sorrows behind polite smiles. And that lesson would later make her one of the most emotionally honest actresses Hollywood had ever seen. By the time she was 11 years old, Shirley danced the role of Clara in Tchaikovsky's The Nutcracker. Her small body had grown stronger, but her heart was still uncertain. Every round of applause felt like proof that she existed. Every spotlight felt like borrowed love. Behind all that grace was exhaustion that no child should ever carry. But she kept going because endurance was the only language she understood. Years later, when people asked her about those early days, Shirley would say something that breaks my heart every time I hear it. She said, "Maybe I kept dancing all my life because I was still trying to stand up from that first fall." Think about that. Even when she became famous, even when millions of people knew her name, part of her was still that little girl with weak ankles, trying desperately to prove she could stand on her own. When Shirley turned 16 in 1950, she made a decision that would terrify most teenagers. She packed a single suitcase, put on a coat that was too thin for winter, and moved to New York City all by herself. She believed that the stage could save her life, that somehow if she could just make it in the theater, everything would be okay. New York was absolutely merciless. The city was loud and dazzling and cruel all at the same time. Its bright lights seemed to mock her instead of welcome her. The freezing wind cut through her cheap coat like it was made of paper. She rented a tiny room on 46th Street, the kind of place where the wallpaper was peeling off the walls and the heat only worked when it felt like it. She waited tables during the day to earn money for food. She taught dance classes at night to pay her rent. And by candlelight she would count the few coins she had left, trying to figure out if she could afford soup for dinner. On good nights, she could buy a small bowl of soup and feel grateful. On bad nights, she would dance in her dark room just to stay warm, pretending she had just come from a successful performance. "I used to walk home through the snow," she remembered years later, "pretending I'd just come from the theater just to feel like I belonged somewhere." Can you imagine that? A 16-year-old girl so lonely that she had to pretend she had a place in the world just to keep going. Sometimes she almost believed her own pretending. But when morning came, she would wake up to the sound of water dripping from broken pipes and the dull ache in her bones, reminding her that dreams can be colder than any winter. Broadway wasn't a stage back then. It was a battlefield. Every single day, hundreds of girls would stand outside theaters, all hoping for the same chance, all wearing their best smiles and their last bit of hope. The directors would walk down the line and say cruel things without even thinking about it. Too tall, too serious, not pretty enough. Once, a casting director actually laughed at her and said, "You move like a soldier, not a lady." Shirley thanked him politely, just like her mother taught her to do. Then she went home and practiced until her feet bled. That night she wrapped her damaged toes in medical tape and whispered to herself, "You dance until life remembers you exist." Weeks turned into months. The hunger didn't go away. It just learned to live inside her alongside her ambition. Sometimes she would fall asleep with her dance shoes still on because she was too exhausted to take them off, too afraid that if she stopped moving for even a moment, the dream would disappear like smoke. She watched other girls give up and go back home to safety. But something stubborn inside Shirley refused to quit. "If the world won't give me a stage," she said once, "then I'll build one out of my own scars." And then in 1954, fate arrived in the strangest way possible. Shirley was 20 years old, working as an understudy in a Broadway show called The Pajama Game. An understudy is someone who learns all the main performer's parts just in case something goes wrong. It's a thankless job. You do all the work but never get the glory. Until one night everything changed. The lead actress, Carol Haney, twisted her ankle badly just minutes before the curtain was supposed to go up. Panic swept through everyone backstage. The show was about to start and they didn't have their star. Someone grabbed Shirley and shoved a costume into her trembling hands. "You're on," they said. Backstage was complete chaos. The smell of sweat, perfume, and pure fear filled the air. The stage manager was shouting instructions. The bright lights were already blazing. And for just one heartbeat, Shirley almost turned around and ran away. She was terrified. But then something inside her took over. She ran toward that stage instead of away from it. The brightness of those spotlights hit her like a physical wave. Suddenly, the entire audience was right there in front of her. Hundreds of faceless people, all waiting, all watching. She took her position on stage, her whole body shaking. The music started, and then something magical happened. Every bit of pain she had ever known, every rejection, every cold night, every blister, every tear, All of it rose up through her body and transformed into pure movement, into defiance, into light itself. When the curtain finally fell at the end, there was silence. That same terrible silence that had followed Shirley her entire life. And then, like thunder rolling across the sky, the applause came. It sounded like rain on a roof. It sounded like proof that she was real. She stood frozen on that stage, dizzy, half crying, unable to believe what had just happened. For the first time in her entire life, she wasn't invisible anymore. In the audience that night was a man named Hal Wallace, one of the most powerful movie producers in all of Hollywood. He had seen thousands of performers in his career, but he had never seen a girl who danced like she was literally fighting for her life. After the show ended, he found Shirley backstage. She was still breathless, her costume was frayed, and her eyes were wide with disbelief. "You," he said, looking right at her, "belong on film." It sounded like a miracle, like something from a fairy tale. But Shirley knew better than to believe in miracles. She knew that miracles were really just payments that life owed you after years of suffering. "Sometimes destiny doesn't knock politely," she would say later. "It limps in late and unexpected, just when you think you can't stand for one more second." That night, back in her tiny room, Shirley sat on her bed and placed her aching feet in a basin of cold water. She watched the bruises blooming on her skin like dark purple flowers, and she smiled through the pain. The city hadn't beaten her, not yet, because from hunger, from rejection, from frost and exhaustion and loneliness, she had carved out the one thing nobody could ever take away from her, a name that would one day light up the entire world. That one night changed everything, though Shirley didn't fully understand it yet. Within weeks, she boarded a train heading west to California. She had one small suitcase, a worn pair of ballet shoes, and less than $300 to her name. Behind her were the narrow stages of Broadway where she had suffered and survived. Ahead of her was Hollywood, an empire built on beautiful illusions, ruled by powerful men who decided which dreams got to live and which ones died. Her first movie was called The Trouble with Harry, made in 1955 and directed by the legendary Alfred Hitchcock. It was a quiet comedy about death, and the irony wasn't lost on Shirley. She was breathing new life into her own story. That role earned her a Golden Globe Award for New Star of the Year. And soon the entire industry started whispering her name with something that sounded like respect: Shirley MacLaine. Within just 5 years, she became a Hollywood phenomenon. She starred in Some Came Running in 1958 alongside Frank Sinatra. Then came The Apartment in 1960. A Billy Wilder masterpiece that made over $25 million and won 5 Academy Awards. To the world watching, she was unstoppable, a force of nature. But behind all that applause was exhaustion so deep it physically hurt to smile. Between 1955 and 1965, Shirley made more than 15 films. She often worked 20-hour days, collapsing into sleep still wearing full makeup between takes. "I lived on coffee and adrenaline," she confessed years later. Her voice, which used to be so soft, grew harder. Her laughter became shorter. Her body began to ache in places that no spotlight could ever reach. But every single morning she returned to the set. Because for women in Hollywood back then, working wasn't just about survival. It was about rebellion. "They called me difficult," she said many years later with a sad smile. "I called it being honest. And that honesty came with a brutal price." In 1959, Shirley discovered something that made her blood boil. She found out that her producer, Hal Wallace, the same man who had discovered her, was making a fortune off her 7-year contract. Every time he loaned her out to work on another studio's film, he would collect $250,000. Meanwhile, Shirley only received $18,000 per film. She was making him rich while she struggled to pay her own bills. So she did something that no actress had ever dared to do before. She sued Paramount Pictures and Hal Wallace for $1 million. In 1959, that was an absolutely staggering amount of money. It was an act of defiance that shocked everyone. Hollywood immediately turned its back on her. For almost 2 years, she was blacklisted. Studios refused to hire her. Directors who used to call her their friend suddenly didn't know her name. She was erased from casting lists like she had never existed. Friends stopped calling. The studio gates that used to swing open for her now stayed locked like prison doors. But Shirley didn't bow down. She didn't apologize. She didn't back down. When she finally won the case in 1961, It wasn't just her personal victory. It changed Hollywood forever. She broke the old studio system that had been locking actors into restrictive, unfair contracts for decades. "They thought they'd break me," she said later, her voice strong and clear. "They didn't understand. I don't break. I bend and then I dance again." The 1960s brought both incredible triumph and devastating torment. In 1963, Irma La Douce made her an international superstar. But the fame came with a terrible cost. 10 solid months of non-stop shooting left her so exhausted that she had to be hospitalized. Her body was literally giving out. But still, she smiled for the cameras. Still, she showed up for interviews. Still, she pretended everything was fine. In 1969, she poured her entire soul into a movie called Sweet Charity. It was supposed to be the crown jewel of her career. A lavish musical with dazzling choreography and sets that cost millions of dollars to build. But when the film was released, audiences didn't come. The movie lost over $8 million. It was a devastating failure. "When the theater is empty," Shirley said quietly, "the echo is cruel." For the first time in her life, she questioned everything. Her talent, her worth, her reason for continuing. She would sit alone in her dressing room, staring at movie posters with her own face on them, wondering if the world had moved on without her, if maybe she had given everything she had, and it still wasn't enough. But even in that dark moment of disillusionment, destiny wasn't finished with her yet. In 1970, Shirley took a completely unexpected turn. She starred in Two Mules for Sister Sarah, alongside Clint Eastwood. She played a mysterious nun with secrets as heavy as her silence. The pairing was unexpected, but the chemistry was undeniable. Audiences saw something new in Shirley. She was stripped of all glamour, covered in desert dust but somehow shining even brighter. The film's success proved what few people doubted anymore. She could cross any genre, any generation, with the same fearless grace that had carried her from a ballet studio in Virginia to the legends of cinema. But Shirley was restless. After the failure of Sweet Charity, she turned inward. She began to write books. She began to travel the world searching for meaning. She started listening to the silence that Hollywood had stolen from her for so many years. "I used to think the applause would fill the emptiness inside me," she wrote in one of her books. It never did. It just echoed louder inside the hollow places. Her rebirth came in 1977 with a film called The Turning Point. It was about aging dancers facing regret and lost dreams. Art imitating life. The performance earned her a 4th Oscar nomination and, more importantly, gave her peace. She had proven she could still move audiences, still make them feel something real. Then came 1983 and Terms of Endearment. Shirley played Aurora Greenway, a fierce, loving, impossible, utterly real mother. She gave the performance of a lifetime. The film earned over $108 million at the box office and won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. On the night of April 9, 1984, something happened that Shirley had been waiting for her entire life. She finally heard her name called for Best Actress at the Academy Awards. As she walked up onto that stage with tears shaking in her voice, she said 3 words that shocked the world. "I deserve this." People gasped. Some thought it sounded arrogant. But it wasn't arrogance. It was truth. It was a declaration from a woman who had bled for every single spotlight, who had sacrificed pieces of her soul for her art, who had been told she wasn't good enough so many times that she finally decided to tell herself a different story. The applause that followed wasn't just celebration. It was redemption. Shirley's success brought her significant wealth. From that girl who once rented a single room in New York to a woman who now owns a 7,000-acre ranch in New Mexico, she built an estimated net worth of over $50 million. But as she once said with a knowing smile, "Money never changed me. It only paid the bills of my soul." Her wealth wasn't built on luck or connections. It was carved from discipline, defiance, and unshakable faith in her own voice. Every dollar, every trophy, every scar on her feet, they're all proof that endurance can build its own kind of empire. But glory never came without storms. In 1963, when a gossip columnist named Mike Connolly printed lies about her in his newspaper, Shirley didn't hide. She marched straight into his office and confronted him face to face. Some reports even said it got physical. The headlines screamed about the scandal, but regular people applauded her. In an era when women were expected to smile through humiliation, Shirley refused. She challenged directors who asked her to do nude scenes when she wasn't comfortable. She confronted award committees about bias against women. She spoke up when staying silent would have been safer and easier. "She's too strong," powerful men said, trying to put her in her place. "That's why she's still here," history replied. But even at the height of success, there were nights when Shirley sat alone in her Malibu home, listening to the ocean wind carry memories she couldn't quiet. Success, she reflected once, is just a different kind of pressure. The golden Oscar statue on her shelf didn't silence the echoes of exhaustion, but it reminded her of what she had survived. Sometimes she would whisper to herself, "Every time I fell, I got curious about what falling felt like from a different height." It was her way of saying that life never stopped testing her, but she never stopped standing back up. Now let me tell you about the love story that nobody expected, the marriage that confused an entire generation. Because Shirley MacLaine didn't just live differently than other people, she loved differently too. In 1954, young Shirley was lighting up Broadway in The Pajama Game when she met a man named Steve Parker. He was a sophisticated stage producer with a diplomat's poise and a storyteller's charm. To Shirley, he was the first man who actually listened to what she wasn't saying out loud. "Steve was my best friend first," she said later. "He saw who I was before Hollywood ever did." They married in 1956, but it wasn't a traditional marriage from the start. It was less a promise of possession and more a pact of understanding. They agreed to something that society thought was absolutely scandalous. They would have an open marriage. Each of them would be free to live their own lives, pursue their own dreams, even love other people, as long as they were honest with each other. Their early years together were like a dance between continents. Shirley was in California, conquering Hollywood under relentless lights and impossible schedules. Steve was in Tokyo, Japan, building theater companies and making his own name in the arts. They would write letters that crossed the Pacific Ocean like lifelines connecting two distant shores. "You're everywhere I look," he once wrote to her. She replied, "Maybe that's why I miss you less, because I see you in everything." In 1956, their daughter Sachi was born into this unusual arrangement, a child of two dreamers living on opposite sides of the world. While Shirley worked in California, Sachi spent most of her childhood with Steve in Tokyo. There were visits and phone calls and letters written on hotel stationery, but never enough time together, never enough presence. "I wanted her to know she was loved," Shirley said years later. "Even if love didn't always live in the same house. But the world wasn't ready for their kind of marriage. How can you keep love alive across the Pacific Ocean?" Reporters would ask, half mocking, half genuinely curious. Shirley would only smile mysteriously and say, "By not trying to cage it." She was a woman living in the 1950s and 60s with a soul that was decades ahead of her time. When she and Steve agreed to their open marriage, it wasn't rebellion or indulgence. It was philosophy. "You can't own a person and call it love," she once explained. "You can only honor their freedom and hope they return to you whole." To outsiders, it sounded absolutely scandalous. To them, it was simply truth. They shared an unspoken faith that honesty mattered more than geography. He knew about her life in Hollywood. She knew about his nights in Tokyo. Yet in every letter there was tenderness, humor, and deep respect. "Are you sure you want this kind of freedom?" Steve once asked her. Shirley answered quietly, "Freedom isn't what breaks love. Lies do. But freedom carries its own heavy weight." By the late 1960s, when Shirley was filming Sweet Charity, exhaustion often blurred the edges of her triumph. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, she would drive home through empty Los Angeles streets, her face still painted with stage makeup, her body aching with tiredness. She would sometimes park beneath a billboard advertising her own movie, her name shining in bright lights above her, and whisper to herself, "Everyone sees me, but who really knows me?" Meanwhile, Steve's world in Japan had become vibrant and full, a whirlwind of art and new connections. Distance grew between them slowly and silently, not as betrayal, but as time's quiet arithmetic. They had built a love too large for one life to contain, and somewhere between all those letters and all those layovers at airports, they began to drift apart. Sometimes, Shirley confessed later, freedom is just another word for loneliness. Their final meeting was quiet, almost like a scene from a movie. It was a gray morning in Tokyo at a small tea house tucked behind a narrow street. They didn't fight. They didn't cry. They just talked about music and travel and the strangeness of fame. When it was time to leave, Steve simply touched her hand gently and said, "Take care of that fire inside you." She nodded, smiling through the ache in her chest. That was their goodbye. Unspoken, eternal. In 1982, after 28 years of marriage, they divorced. There were no dramatic headlines, no bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement that their journey together had changed form. When Steve passed away in 2001, Shirley held a small memorial service on her ranch in New Mexico. No photographers, no Hollywood guests, just the sound of desert wind and the soft flicker of candles. A framed photo of Steve rested on a table beside her. "Some people never leave," she whispered. "They just change rooms." Even now, all these years later, she still calls him the love of her life. When asked if she ever regretted her unconventional marriage, she laughed. That low, knowing laugh that the world remembers. "Not at all," she said. "We didn't fail. We simply ran out of geography." But there's another love story that Shirley kept hidden for over 60 years. A secret she carried in her heart through marriages and movies and decades of silence. During the filming of Some Came Running in 1958, she met someone who would haunt her forever. Dean Martin. He was the man with the velvet voice and the careless grin. The kind of man who didn't need to chase attention because it followed him naturally. Both of them were married at the time. Both were guarded by reputations larger than themselves. But on that movie set, away from all the headlines and cameras, there was something quieter happening. A connection too deep to deny. Between takes, they would sit side by side, sharing coffee and secrets that had nothing to do with the script. He would make her laugh until her eyes shone with joy. She would make him forget how tired he was of pretending to be Dean Martin for the world. He never flirted, Shirley recalled. He didn't have to. He was already inside my silence. Their bond grew through the late 50s and early 60s, slipping past the public eye like a melody too soft for gossip to catch. They would meet after rap parties and drive aimlessly through Los Angeles, or share quiet dinners where words were few but meaning was endless. When Dean sang, Shirley swore he wasn't performing. He was remembering all the things they couldn't have, the life that could never be theirs. He had a sadness I recognized, she said decades later. It was like hearing my own heartbeat in someone else's chest. But Hollywood's reality eventually intruded. Their lives were moving in opposite directions. She was headed to Europe for film shoots. He was drowning deeper into the Rat Pack whirlwind. They parted not in anger but in quiet recognition that some loves are too pure for permanence. "We didn't end," she once said softly. "We just stopped meeting." For more than 60 years, Shirley kept that love hidden. She spoke about freedom and self-discovery in her many books, but never about Dean. Perhaps because some truths are too sacred to sell. It wasn't until her 91st year, looking back across the vast landscape of her extraordinary life, that she finally whispered what her heart had known all along. He was the love of my life. Even now, when his songs play on the radio, she still pauses, not to mourn but to remember, to honor the one man who reminded her that even in a life of freedom, there was one person who could make her feel like home. But perhaps the most heartbreaking chapter of Shirley's life is her relationship with her only daughter, Sachi. This is the part of the story that makes even the strongest people cry, because sometimes love isn't enough to bridge the distance between a mother and child. Sachi was born in 1956, into a situation that was complicated from the very beginning. When she was just 2 years old, she was taken to live in Japan with her father, Steve. He promised stability. Shirley convinced herself she was doing the right thing. "She'll be safe there," Shirley told her friends. "The world here is too cruel for a child. But oceans don't just separate continents. They separate hearts." While cameras rolled in Hollywood and Shirley's name echoed through sound stages, little Sachi was in Tokyo, being tucked into bed by strangers. The child would fall asleep holding a magazine photo of her mother, tracing the edges of her smile with small, trembling fingers. She learned very early that sometimes a person can belong to everyone in the world and still not be yours. Shirley believed she was protecting her daughter from the dark shadows of fame. But protection, when it's built from distance, can feel exactly like abandonment. Letters crossed the Pacific Ocean. Thick paper with soft ink and motherly advice written between shooting schedules. "Study hard," she wrote. Be brave. Be curious. But love sent through envelopes fades differently than love delivered in person. It arrives days late, smelling of someone else's perfume, feeling hollow. One letter came back unopened, stamped, returned to sender. Shirley kept it anyway. Years later, the crease where she had folded it still carried the shape of her hand and the salt stains of her tears. Sachi grew up under another roof, speaking another language, living in another rhythm. She learned politeness before she learned affection. She learned independence before she learned trust. And somewhere deep in her heart, a quiet ache took root. Not anger exactly, not resentment. Just the hollow feeling that forms when love becomes nothing more than a photograph on a wall. By the late 1970s, mother and daughter finally reunited. But Sachi was no longer the small girl waiting by the mailbox. She was a grown woman now, cautious and composed and beautifully wounded. They talked, but carefully. Shirley asked questions that sounded like apologies she couldn't quite say out loud. Sachi answered like someone who had rehearsed forgiveness, but hadn't yet felt it in her heart. They walked together once through a Los Angeles park, talking about the weather and movies and anything except the years they had lost. She was there, Sachi said later, but not really. And Shirley, in her own quiet way, might have said the same thing. She could memorize a movie script in a single day, but she never learned how to say the words "I'm sorry" to her own daughter. Nobody had ever taught her that some lines have to come from the soul, not from a page. Then came 2013. The silence finally found its voice. Sachi published a memoir called Lucky Me, My Life With and Without My Mom, Shirley MacLaine. The title alone felt like a knife wrapped in velvet. In its pages, she described a childhood of absence and distant admiration. A mother who existed in movie posters and magazine headlines but never in the room when she needed her. I was raised by maids, nannies, and strangers, Sachi wrote. I wanted my mother, but she was always somewhere else. In another movie. Another world, Hollywood gasped. Headlines screamed. The tabloids waited for a bitter war between mother and daughter. But Shirley didn't rage. She didn't defend herself with lawyers or angry interviews. She simply said softly, "It's almost entirely fiction. I still love her, that was all." Just 6 words. No lawsuit. No media battle. No bitterness. Just grace. And when reporters pressed her for more, she smiled faintly and said, "She has her truth and I have mine. I hope someday she'll understand mine too." It wasn't pride speaking. It wasn't surrender. It was acceptance. The kind that only grows after years of standing alone with your mistakes. Later, in a quieter interview, Shirley revealed something that breaks my heart. She said, "When I read her book, I didn't cry. I just thought, well, that's how she saw it. Maybe I wasn't there enough for her to see me any other way." That single line, so fragile and unguarded, said everything. It wasn't guilt. It was clarity. Understanding that love, no matter how fierce, can still fail to arrive where it's needed most. Now, at 91 years old, Shirley MacLaine lives in a way that feels like a quiet miracle. One that was earned, not given. She lives on her sprawling 7,000-acre ranch in Abiquiu, New Mexico, surrounded by red mesas and endless skies that look like paintings. She bought the property back in the 1990s when she was desperate for refuge from fame's constant noise. Her home is over 7,000 square feet, filled with the things that matter most to her now. Her books on philosophy and spirituality, stacks of old film scripts, framed photos of her brother Warren, of Sachi, of friends long gone. Out back, there's a stone labyrinth she built herself for meditation. She still walks it every morning as the sun rises over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, her footsteps tracing ancient patterns of reflection. Her estimated net worth today is around $60 million. That wealth is the visible reflection of a lifetime of invisible work. She earned every single dollar through persistence rather than privilege. In her prime during the 60s and 70s, she was one of the highest-paid actresses in the world. She was also one of the first women in Hollywood to own her own production company, keeping creative control when studios preferred their actresses to be silent and obedient. She owns properties beyond just her New Mexico ranch. There's a luxury apartment in Malibu with sweeping views of the Pacific Ocean, where she sometimes retreats for the sound of waves. She once owned a Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud and a Mercedes. Now she drives a modest hybrid SUV through the desert roads. "The earth has given me everything," she once said. "The least I can do is drive something kind to her." Her jewelry collection includes vintage, Cartier pieces gifted by directors and a diamond watch that Frank Sinatra gave her after they filmed Some Came Running together. But the objects that truly hold value for her are simpler things. Handwritten notes from Jack Lemmon, a small jade elephant she bought on her first trip to Asia, a symbol of luck and resilience and memory. She donates generously and quietly, without seeking attention. Over the last decade, she has given more than $5 million to causes close to her heart. Animal welfare, Native American cultural preservation, arts education for underprivileged children. You give what you can when you can, she said. Not because you owe the world, but because it once gave you a chance.